Take a look at a map of the world. Usually we look at the Mercator projection, where the Arctic is just a stretched, distorted white strip at the very top. It looks empty. It looks irrelevant. But if you look at the world through the eyes of a general, a logistician, or an oil tycoon, from the top down, directly over the North Pole, you see a completely different picture. You don't see an empty ocean. You see the Mediterranean of the 21st century. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, this region holds 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and a staggering 30% of its natural gas. We are talking about resources that could power empires for decades. But it's not just about what lies beneath. It is about the water itself. A trade route is opening up that could bankrupt the Suez Canal. And, terrifyingly, this is the shortest flight trajectory for a nuclear missile between the great powers. While the global media is distracted by the sands of the Middle East and the trenches of Eastern Europe, the real battle for the future is unfolding in the silence of the ice. Donald Trump is talking about buying Greenland. Russia is launching nuclear icebreakers. China is declaring itself a near-Arctic state. Today, we're going to deep dive into the anatomy of this conflict. We will analyze how the Kremlin lost $30 billion in a single signature in the Barents Sea. We will solve the mystery of the Lomonosov Ridge, and we will explain why the melting ice isn't just an ecological disaster, it is the catalyst for the next world war. To understand why this conflict is happening now, we need to look at the history of how nations claim ice. In the early 20th century, the rules were simple. They called it the sectoral principle. Imagine a pie chart. You take a ruler, place it on the map, and draw lines from the western and eastern borders of your country directly to the North Pole. Everything inside that triangle, land, water, ice, was considered yours. Under this system, the Soviet Union and Canada possessed massive slices of the Arctic. It was the era of 2D geopolitics, simple lines on a flat map. But in 1982, the game changed. The United Nations adopted the Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNLOS. The sectoral principle was thrown into the trash. The new rules were based on geology, not geometry. Now, a nation's territory extends only as far as its continental shelf extends underwater. Suddenly, those massive triangles vanished. The high seas became international waters, open to anyone, including the United States, which, ironically, never ratified the convention but is happy to exploit its loopholes. This shift created a legal vacuum, and in that vacuum, a fierce race began to prove who actually owns the ocean floor. This brings us to the most contested piece of real estate on Earth, the Lomonosov Ridge. It is a massive underwater mountain range that stretches across the polar circle, connecting Siberia to the Americas. Why does a pile of underwater rocks matter? Because under the 1982 rules, if you can prove that this ridge is a geological extension of your mainland, you own the seabed. And the seabed is where the trillions of dollars in resources are hiding. Russia claims the Lomonosov and Mendeleev ridges are a continuation of the Siberian shelf. Denmark, acting through Greenland, claims, no, it is an extension of Greenland. Canada argues it belongs to the North American plate. This is the key to understanding Donald Trump's obsession with Greenland. It's not about building hotels. If the U.S. controls Greenland, it inherits Denmark's claim to the Lomonosov Ridge. It inherits a legal claim to the center of the Arctic Ocean. Without Greenland, America is merely a guest in the Arctic. With Greenland, it becomes a landlord. But legal battles in the UN are slow. Sometimes nations try to make deals, and here, history offers a brutal lesson in Western diplomacy. Let's go back to 2010, the Barents Sea. For decades, the Soviet Union and Norway argued over a disputed zone of 175,000 square kilometers. The Soviets held their ground. But in 2010, the Kremlin decided to change tactics. President Dmitry Medvedev signed a treaty with Norwegian Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg, the man who would later become the Secretary General of NATO. Russia voluntarily ceded this massive territory to Norway. The logic in Moscow was naive. If we show we are civilized partners and follow international law, the West will support our claims for the Lomonosov Ridge at the UN. They thought it was a fair trade, territory for legitimacy. They were wrong. Almost immediately after the ink dried, Norwegian geologists entered the newly acquired waters. What did they find? Hydrocarbon deposits worth an estimated 30 billion euros. Norway got the oil and gas. Stoltenberg got a victory. And Russia? Russia got nothing. The UN Commission still hasn't approved their claims on the Lomonosov Ridge. This was a wake-up call for the realists in Moscow. It proved that in the Arctic, international law is often just a tool for the cunning to disarm the naive. The era of concessions is over. Now, let's look at the surface. The ice is melting, and this is rewriting the map of global trade. We are witnessing the emergence of two new superhighways. Route 1, the Northwest Passage. This runs along the coast of Canada and Alaska. Historically, this was a graveyard for explorers, but as the ice recedes, it is becoming viable. Compare the distance. To ship goods from New York to Tokyo via the Panama Canal takes 18,200 kilometers. Via the Northwest Passage, only 14,000 kilometers. That is a massive saving in fuel and time. But there is a problem. Canada lacks infrastructure. They have few icebreakers and deep-water ports. This is another reason the U.S. is looking north with hungry eyes. They want to secure this route, whether Ottawa likes it or not. Route 2. The Northern Sea Route, NSR. This runs along Russia's coastline. And here, the situation is different. Russia has the world's only nuclear icebreaker fleet. They are building ports and rescue centers. For China, this route is a lifeline. Beijing calls it the Polar Silk Road. Why? Because the traditional route to Europe goes through the Suez Canal and the Strait of Malacca. These are choke points. They can be blocked by pirates, by Houthi rebels, or, in a war scenario, by the U.S. Navy. The Arctic route is safe from American interference. It is faster, and it is becoming the backbone of a new Eurasian alliance between Moscow and Beijing. When trade routes open, navies follow. The Arctic is rapidly remilitarizing. In 2019, U.S. Navy Secretary Richard Spencer explicitly stated, "We must challenge the presence of Russia and China in the high north." The physics of war here are unique. First, nuclear strategy. The Arctic ice cap is the perfect garage for ballistic missile submarines. A submarine sitting under the ice is invisible to satellites and sonar. It can surface, launch a strike, and vanish before the enemy reacts. Russia has restored its Soviet-era bastion defense strategy, rebuilding bases on the New Siberian Islands and Franz Josef Land to protect these submarines. Second, missile defense. The shortest path for a missile from Russia to the U.S. is not across the Atlantic, but over the North Pole. Control of the Arctic sky is control of national survival. This is why we see Finland and Sweden joining NATO. The Baltic and the Arctic are merging into one single theater of operations. Washington is terrified of a scenario where Chinese naval groups use Russian ports to project power into the Atlantic. This would fundamentally break the U.S. naval containment strategy. So, where does this leave us? The melting ice has exposed a world of naked ambition. The world is hungry for resources, and the Arctic is the last pantry. We see three scenarios for the next decade. Scenario 1. Spheres of influence. The Arctic powers agree to carve up the region, with Russia controlling its sector, NATO controlling theirs, and China paying for transit. This is unlikely given the current distrust. Scenario 2. The gray zone. A state of permanent lawfare, endless legal disputes in the UN, non-recognition of borders, and shadow wars involving sabotage of pipelines and cables. Scenario 3. Kinetic conflict, an accidental clash between icebreakers or submarines that spirals into a hot war. One thing is certain, the Arctic is no longer a zone of peace. The ice is melting and the sharks are circling. As the ancient geopolitical maxim goes, he who commands the north sits on top of the world. Subscribe. We track the shifts that others ignore.